At their best, communities foster a deep emotional attachment to a shared identity that comes from working, playing, volunteering, laughing and crying together. Now this panel will discuss whether or not this community spirit or identity can be maintained and honored as part of a larger entity. We have two guests for this panel. A third guest was to have joined us, but I understand is not able to be here. First up, Gian-Carlo Carra, Councillor, City of Calgary. Gian-Carlo, first elected to Calgary City Council in 2010, and in 2013 was re-elected to serve the people of Ward 9 for a second term. He was raised in both Calgary and New York City and believes this experience helped shape his pre-politics professional practice in neighborhood-based urban design, academic research on the relationship between people and place, and activism in pursuit of establishing community-based governance, driving and consensus regarding neighborhood change. As well, Tracey Vavrek, Chief Executive Officer, Community Foundation of Northwest Alberta. For the past 12 years, Tracey has held the position of CEO of the Community Foundation of Northwestern Alberta. During that time, the organization has grown its managed assets from $150,000 to $5.9 million. Wow. Focused on building community capacity, Tracey and the foundation work with donors to create endowment funds in support of community, charitable organizations and causes. The foundation also provides leadership resources to strengthen the charitable sector. An interesting discussion. Gian-Carlo, why don't you come on up and start us off, please?
So I'm super excited to be here, everybody. This is, I think this could not have gone off better than it's going off, and hopefully I will contribute. I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their schedules to be here. I think this is a vital conversation to be having, and I want to thank the last mayor of Grand Prairie for helping organize this. I hope everyone can see my sort of like dark and orange presentation. I'm going to be talking about three things today in three different groups, and the title of this session, of course, is Building and Maintaining Community Identity, and it says an urban designer's reflection on the importance of scale. Feel free to blank out urban designer and put the word city at which I learned today and I love. Let's see. Okay, three things I'm going to be talking about. I come from a belief that community is really about the relationship between people and place, and my focus has always been on the place side of that. So I'm going to sort of give you a quick introduction into what I believe places are about, how complete communities function, how neighborhoods and villages, which sort of are the same increment of the project of civilization, are essential to community. Then I'm going to take us to Italy. I've got an Italian name, Gian-Carlo Carra. I'm going to take you to where my father's family comes from and sort of illustrate some things. And then I'm going to talk about Calgary's historic neighborhoods that I have the honor of representing, the current community boundaries that are regulated on the landscape, and amalgamation discussions that are taking place within these communities and neighborhoods in the city of Calgary. So, the neighborhood unit to begin. And I just threw this on there because, you know, I think the project of building cities today is very much like the project of building the country. It's along linear lines with neighborhoods linked by transit. We built our nation on that kind of growth pattern, that transit-oriented development pattern. This is just a picture of the Canadian Pacific network. Now, this is a cartoon from a guy named Leon Creer, who in the 1960s called BS on the project of modernism and started trying to understand how cities worked. And he was a European-based guy, but there's a lot of wisdom to be learned from this. And what he noted was that in the post-war era, we started to design our habitat like this, where we were, can anyone see that? Barely. We started to basically create a city and places of zones where we were focusing on creating single things. And he said traditionally the human habitat of cities, towns, villages were built much more like a baked pizza pie, where you had completeness, and anytime you sliced the pie, you had the whole thing, rather than having a block of cheese and a bowl of tomatoes and a bag of flour and saying, enjoy your pizza. This is another sort of argument that the city of the post-war era is growth by hypertrophy. It's like the cell that won't divide. And traditionally, human habitats have always grown by reaching a certain size, and then the cell divides. And that's why I honestly think that the analogy of the neighborhood as being like a cell, and again, a neighborhood and a village are the same increment. Neighborhoods are networked together to form towns and cities. Villages sit alone on the landscape. They're the same. They're as essential to the project of civilization as family. They're just the next order of organization. These are just cartoons that he drew to show. This is a diagram from a guy named Clarence Perry, who's famous in planning circles. In 1929, the regional plan of New York went underway, and he sort of talked about building communities in these historic patterns of the walkable neighborhood, 500 meters center to edge. What's sort of interesting about 1929 is that's when we stopped doing that, and we started doing something else. But it makes sense. I don't know if you can see, but there's a red circle around here, and that's a 500-meter radius. And I just randomly selected some of the historic neighborhoods in the city of Calgary. This is Cliff Bungalow and Mission, where the main street of 4th Street runs down, and it's got the natural boundaries of the escarpment and the Elbow River, and then the main street on the north of 17th Avenue. And you have that neighborhood unit there on the landscape, pre-planning, pre-conception, it's there. It's all over the world. Here's another one. Here's Sunnyside in Calgary. You can see that the school is in the dead center, and it's got the escarpment and the river as natural boundaries, and then it's got the main street of the commercial shopping district of Kensington as the other boundary. These are patterns that are time-honored and timeless. These, of course, are very urban examples. I'm going to get into more rural examples a little bit later. And this is, there was an amalgamation in the beginning of the 2000s for an area of Calgary called the Beltline. It's just south of the downtown. It was a series of neighborhoods that were loosely affiliated under the community name Connaught, and then another couple of neighborhoods that were loosely affiliated under the name Victoria Park. And through self-motivated work with the development community and fighting City Hall, they worked an amalgamation where they are now the Beltline communities. But within that, within that, you have, can anyone see this, or is this just, am I wasting our time here? Okay. You can see that this is one of the neighborhoods in Connaught, and in the dead center of that is Lougheed House, and it's got a commercial main street here that goes underneath the tracks into the downtown. It's got a commercial main street that goes in. This is the exact same scale. It's got the warehouse district along the railroad tracks, and then it's got Western Canada High School and 17th Avenue as its other boundary. These patterns exist on the landscape. We've forgotten how to build them, but they're very important. This is from the 90s, when we started to try and figure out what complete communities meant. This is a traditional neighborhood development diagram based on the 1929 Clarence Perry diagram. And this is from the end of the 2000s, sort of an updated version called the Sustainable Neighborhood Unit by a guy named Doug Farr. But the point is, these neighborhood boundaries, the scale of human habitat, it's based on a 5-minute walk. These are essential. And if I can suggest anything, I'm trying to add another dimension to the talk that we're having today, that scale and getting that right in terms of a physical place is just as important as the sense of community, and is just as important as how we regulate and govern our spaces. So I'm now going to take you to an ancient example, and this is the Piedmont Model. Piedmont, or Piemonte, as we say in northern Italy. It means foothills. It's a region of Italy. And this is a picture of me working with a guy named Mike Holmes and a design team. One of the last jobs I did as a professional consultant before becoming a politician was helping him design his first community on the flank of Okotoks, and it had all of the issues of being outside the urban boundary and trying to build something that made sense for the town and for the community. And this part of the presentation I developed for that, where we brought hundreds of people out to see Mike Holmes, and we sat down, we designed the community with them and tried to get both municipal councils working together. This is from the Washington, D.C., the rural area surrounding Washington, D.C., where they have huge problems maintaining this heritage farmland. It says, you know, where they're basically plowing over these legacy agricultural environments. Here's another one, large lot zoning, covered the whole county. Used to be able to land there. And someone, you know, they're saying, let's drive out to the country, which is the whole point of living out in those environments. They're not working landscapes. How do you make these places work? This is a diagram that talks about, you know, on the bottom is what we're doing today, and on the top is what we did traditionally, and what I believe we have to start doing again, just having coherent boundaries, real rural working landscapes. And so when we talk about a divide between urban and rural, I think the really sort of weird thing is that neither sides are doing that. We're doing suburban. We're not building human habitat. We're building automobile habitat, and we're learning that it's sort of ruinous financially for all of us. So I'm going to take you to the Piedmont model. This is the village of Corno Ento, which is a sustainable neighborhood unit in the Doug Farr model, but it's also ancient, like thousands of years old. That basilica right there, that church, sits on a Roman ruin, a Roman temple ruin, and which sits on the ruins of an Etruscan temple. And my father comes from there, and in this little cluster of the main street, you have the town hall, you have the seniors housing, you have the kindergarten, the post office, and the commercial main street. And it's been like that, and it works in that fashion, and has worked in that fashion for thousands of years. And I think all of us should ask ourselves, not just about the next 10 years, not the next election cycle, the next 20 years, but what are we doing on the landscape, and how long is it going to last, and how sustainable is it in that regard? I was sitting at the cafe drinking a macchiato, and it was market day, where the plaza in front of the church turns into a farmer's market. And I had this vision of the area that was based on a certain scale, because Corno Ento refers to 400. It was a Roman outpost 400 miles from Rome. It has been ruled in its thousands-year history from Rome. It's been ruled from Milan. It's been ruled from Paris. And the attitude of the locals is they don't really care where they're ruled from over there. It doesn't matter as much as their place. As a matter of fact, at the end of the 1600s, the ruling classes, the merchants and the nobility of Corno Ento and a variety of villages in the area decided that what they really needed to take the commerce and culture of the area to the next level was to build a city. And so in the early 1700s, the city of Alessandria was founded on the banks of the Tanaro River, sort of in this area that they sort of eked out between them. And so this idea of bottom-up city building is so antithetical to how we look at things here, where it's coming down at us, where we're getting downloaded. And I also want to just point out this sign where it sort of says, you know, Torino, 90 miles, Alessandria, 10 miles. I started to have like this breakdown in my conception of scale, and I'll take you through that. This, of course, is an ancient map of Italy and shows that, you know, these settlements have been there for thousands of years. And here's a more modern map, and that triangle up at the top is the area that I'm really concerned in. It's almost an equilateral triangle between Milan, Torino, where the Olympics were held, and Genoa on the coast, and right smack in the middle of that is the city of Alessandria. And Alessandria has a relationship to the city to the north, Casale Monferrato. It's very much like Calgary and Edmonton. They're rivals. They have sports teams that play against each other. And, you know, it's a drive through countryside, sort of different, you go from flatlands into more of an aspen parkland in these sort of foothills. It's not aspen parkland, but you move through different landscapes. And the villages that I have pointed out there are just a small, small fraction of the villages that are on the landscape. I also want to say Valenza, sort of in my mental conception of the area, was kind of like Red Deer. It's an ancient Jewish goldsmithing town. But these guys, the thing about Corno Ento is that it's the town and it's the landscape around it, which includes an industrial land base where they're producing high-end, they're manufacturing high-end value-added goods. This picture from 9/11, you heard from my bio that I grew up in New York City. The lights that formed that memorial sculpture to commemorate the towers where they'd gone down, that technology was designed and built in Corno Ento, in their little industrial zone. So like this is like world-class, high-end manufacturing and design, industrial design taking place, in this village area. I want to take us on a little road trip. This is a car trip out to the town of Moncalvo, which is the heart of the truffle industry for the world. It's like some of the highest end truffles in the world. And this is what the landscape looks like between, that's the town of Altavilla, and you get to Moncalvo. And I just want to note that you see this tunnel right here? That's one half of the autostrada. And they just tunneled under the hill, In Italy, if there's a beautiful farm, they tunnel under it rather than sort of buy it out and create this huge swath. This is the traditional, and you've got, 300-year-old houses next to a 1960s special. There's two public spaces. There's the formal plaza, which I couldn't capture a shot of, but I thought that the Plaza Cafe captured it. And then there's sort of like the informal fairgrounds where they had a major farmer's market, which is what we drove out to check out. And this is looking out over the landscape from the sort of lookout above the informal plaza area. This is my wife. We had just gotten engaged. This was 2005. And we're looking out at this landscape of high-end agriculture, wine production, food production that is just absolutely astonishing. Not just agribusiness, but agriculture, exporting all over the world and feeding themselves amazingly well. Another little trip, we did a little bike trip between the villages of Corno Ento, Lu, Cucaro, which is the birthplace of Christopher Columbus, Fubina, and back to Corno Ento. This is the landscape we're talking about. Right now, since I've been back, there's been a lot of these fields have turned into solar farms. There's now areas where they have solar arrays, and they're producing a lot of energy. The wine is spectacular. Coming back to Corno Ento. Now, the whole reason I've taken you on this is because I had a conception of the spaces we were dealing with, and then when I was sitting there looking at that wayfinding sign, I realized that my sense of scale was completely false, because that's the boundaries of the city of Calgary imposed upon that landscape. So we have done something with the scale of our settlements that is fundamentally different than what more sustainable parts of the globe, places that have proven to be lasting, have done. And I thought I'd explore that a little bit. So let's look at this diagram here. This was, again, a diagram that I produced. This wavy line right here is the boundaries of the province of Alessandria. So the region of Piemonte consists of like 8 provinces. And imposed on scale, for scale on top of that, is the city of Calgary, and in the more sort of, and that's the MD of foothills. And when you start comparing apples to apples, the MD of foothills has a population of 55,000 versus the province of Alessandria, which is sitting about 430,000 people. Of course, Calgary has 1 million. But then when you back out to the scale of the region, this is the former boundaries of the Calgary Regional Partnership. We lost the 2 outlying rural municipalities. But those are the original boundaries, and you can see that it fits in this region. When you start comparing apples to apples at that scale, it's pretty amazing. Calgary region, 1.3 million people. Piemonte and area, 5.5 to 6 million people. It's an astonishing sort of because my perception is that there was a lot more open landscape and natural space within that heavily populated area. And it's just, we've handled how we build our space differently. So I think understanding what it is we want to build is really important. And I want to talk a little bit about the community I live in Calgary. This is 1924 air photo of the community of Inglewood. I live right here. A lot of the photos I was going to insert into this province, the reason why I've sort of Frankenstein some of these from previous presentations is I lost a lot of my stuff in the flood in my basement last year. This is it in 1960, and the community of Inglewood really had to fight for its life because the 1960 plan for the city of Calgary envisioned a number of freeways meeting on top of the community. Hundreds of homes were slated for destruction, and the community fought City Hall for 10 years, managed to win some significant battles, and was not paved over. It does sort of, when I took over before I became a politician, I was the president of the Community Association. I did that for 10 years. And the big battle we had was, how do we grow in a way that respects our heritage? And it was this bifurcated camps of people who wanted to protect what we had and people who wanted change. And what we had to do is we had to change the conversation from yes or no to where and how. And we started looking into the history of the community. And what we realized, I mean, this diagram just shows that, you know, there's a hole in the middle of the community where the freeway that was built moved through. And what we learned was that was actually sort of the employment center of the communities. And the communities were actually a couple of neighborhoods. There were 4 historic neighborhoods: Brewery Flats, Mills Estates, Pierce Estates, and Inglewood. And in the 1950s, they were just amalgamated into Inglewood. And so when people were up in arms fighting about the character of Inglewood, we're like, well, actually, there's 4 historic neighborhoods here, and each one had a different past and a different future. And actually, we found that having a conversation about where and how and specific character really helped us with both governance and talking about future growth. This is just some ideas about growth that have come in, but you know, I've been having this conversation for a long time. I ran a design camp for my former alma mater, the Faculty of Environmental Design at the University of Calgary. But this is the community of Ramsey, which was also implicated in that fight in the 1960s. And the communities branched off because they didn't really have the same interests in this fight against the freeways. But now there's a big conversation going on about, you know, why do we have 2 community association boards? Why do we have 2 newsletters when we all use the same commercial Main Street? We're having a transit line that's going to run between us and actually link the communities in a more significant way. And, you know, with 3,500 people living in one community and 3,100 living in the other, in a city of 1.2 million people, maybe it's better to have a collective voice. And at the same time, we're having a conversation about where growth should occur and how it should occur. And we're finding that getting into a finer grain understanding of the historic neighborhoods that constitute this community space is really important. And Ramsey was once Grandview on top of Scotchman's Hill and Ramsey, and of course those 4 other neighborhoods. And when you get into that sort of parsing between different areas and how they can come up with different futures and how they interface on a physical design side, the governance question becomes less important. I want to take you to another part of and this is just sort of a design exercise, splitting it up into different character areas. So, you know, I think when we're talking about amalgamation, we should also be talking about a finer grained understanding of what's on the ground. This is an interesting part of the city that I also represent. It's the communities of Earlton, Rideau, Roxborough, which were amalgamated into a hyphenated community, Park Hill, and this is the historic Manchester industrial area. And we did a major design exercise talking about how communities can come together around the proposition of neighborhood change. In the 1980s, we ran the LRT through there, which some of the business owners who still operate businesses along the McLeod Trail Strip refer to the LRT as Little Ralph's train. And, you know, the exercise of building that C-train at the time was very much about finding a path of least resistance. And to this day, the 39th Avenue LRT station right here, you know, a billion-dollar investment to run a transit line, multi-billion to run a transit line like that in today's dollars, this stop is literally like in a back alley with dumpsters. We had a design team come and talk about neighborhood change and work with the communities. There was a design proposition. The communities were 100% against it. And the developers were sort of like limping this compromised proposal across the finish line of city council. And I said, can we do a timeout and maybe all sit down and find a way to make this work? And you know, we came up with a major development proposition, moving the station. And we went from 100% community opposition to 100% or to 85% community support for significant change. Here's just sort of a little bit of a picture of it. And the point is, within this catchment area, these communities are now talking about creating a unified governance system. And it's based on the idea of getting the scale right and the design right, but also understanding, finding efficiencies. So I think it's possible to do both. I honestly believe it's possible to discuss amalgamation, but also really get into a finer grained and better understanding of the community character, and that's based on the scale of the neighborhood to the community, to the area of the city. So I guess my conclusions, and I should probably have like a question mark at the end of conclusions there, is that the project of building communities is a long-term proposition. Change is the only constant. Protectionism will always fail because change is always going to happen. And the whole point of being a community is getting together around the idea of what do you want the change that's going to occur in your community to be. It might be the whole point of coming together as a community is directing change. The relationship between the social, people, and the physical place is super important and cannot be underplayed. And I think new governance and regulatory systems are necessary to address the present and achieve our desired futures together. So that's my proposition to you guys. I hope that was on point to some extent. Thank you for your time.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Gian-Carlo, for your wonderful tour. You brought me back through memory lane quite a bit. I just returned from Italy a couple nights ago, so I'm still a little bit jet-lagged, but I really received, I understood your perspective on the Italian thoughts and the culture and about building community. How many here are from outside of community? Nobody. Everybody's part of community, and that's what I'm here to talk about a bit today. So good afternoon, and thank you, Mayor Bill, for inviting me to share with you. So as the CEO of the Community Foundation, I have a very different perspective as I work at the hub of community. I work with the souls of community. I work for the full community. I don't work for a sector of the community. As a community foundation, we're invested in all sectors. There isn't an area of the community that's not a priority to us. And for over 100 years, community foundations have been working with this mandate. We currently have 191 foundations across our nation, but we have over 1,600 foundations working across the world. And why do we do what we do? Is because we all live in community. We all grow in community. We raise our families. We have children. We have grandchildren. We have our businesses. That's part of the community of the soul. The soul is so important because, as we've just heard just now, we're talking about the fixtures. Well, in Calgary, that Connaught area in the 17th Avenue, I grew up and left over 40 years ago, 15th Avenue. I understand that just the perception of what Connaught was prior and what it is today. And that physical component is just as important as the soul component. And every day I'm seeing what the soul represents in communities. And as community foundations, we work with all sectors from government levels to individuals to wonderful souls that have been part of community forever. And we're very blessed to be part of community. But when you look at the definition of community, it's about, I'm going to read to you, and I do work from notes. I don't have a PowerPoint to share with you today, but I do have some notes because I've got some things I want to ensure that I share with you. But when you look at the Oxford Dictionary, it defines community as a group of people living in the same place or having many similarities. Now, what is it that's in the word community? There's the word unity. And when you look at unity, the definition of unity is to be inclusive, to be committed, to be valued, to have a sense of belonging, to be realistic, and to be connected. So community is truly creating the spirit of unity. When we look on a national perspective, in 2010, 84% of Canadians made financial contributions to their community. The average donation ranged about $446, but it equated to $10.6 billion of charitable gifts in support of communities. In addition to financial donations, many people gave clothes, they gave food, they gave goods. As a result, 94% of Canadians over the age of 15, they gave something to their community. In 2010 as well, we had 47% of Canadians that volunteered. This equated to 13.3 million citizens that committed time, expertise, committed skill. They made a commitment to their community. As well, that equated to 2.07 volunteer hours, which was just fewer than 1.1 million full-time jobs. That's tremendous when you think about that volunteerism, that commitment to give back to your community. There are over 170,000 not-for-profits and charities that employ 2 million people across our nation. That equates to 11% of the overall Canadian workforce. So very, very significant when we look at what community represents, part, and again, that soul of community. Canada has the second largest not-for-profit sector in the world. Anyone know who the first is? Netherlands. Netherlands running at 14%. That's really great. We need to take pride in what we do for our community. And on an Alberta perspective, we're currently sitting with over 19,000 charities. And we shine again as Albertans. There's 51% of Albertans that volunteer their time. Absolutely tremendous for our communities. But really, what does our not-for-profits do? Why are they so important for our community? They do so much good for our community. We know we all seek not-for-profits every day. We get to work with charities. We get asks from them. They're always, they need money, they need resources, they need support. But they're not competing with corporate. They're not competing with government. They're there for a purpose. In every part of community, you're going to see these organizations. They're helping from your local food banks. They're helping your seniors. They're going to be helping with beautiful facilities like our art facility that we're in today, helping with our libraries. They're helping with recreation. There isn't an area in the community you're not going to see not-for-profits providing services. We have an event here that I know Edmonton and other communities have, our Street Performers Festival, all managed on volunteers. Again, volunteers provide so many components that are part of the soul of the community. And they do this through their volunteers. I've already given you the stats and where we're sitting. We know volunteers are a huge component. But they bring their skills, they bring their expertise, and they do it because they hold the community together. So not-for-profits, yes, definitely. They're the scope, they're the basic community. They do reflect and they touch every population. There isn't a charity or a not-for-profit that you have not touched in your role as leaders in the community, because you're touching them, you're talking to them on a daily basis. But also as well, you're using them on a personal level. And sometimes we don't recognize the value of what we're getting from our community groups. In Alberta, 74% of Alberta not-for-profits serve our local communities. And again, that's in our neighborhoods, our cities, our towns, and looking as well at our rural municipalities. This is higher than our national level. Again, Alberta shines. We're at 64%. Absolutely tremendous when we see 64% for us Albertans. So when we talk about our volunteerism, we talk about being committed. There's also the next step of this is looking at our connections. How are we connected and how are we engaged? And at the Community Foundation, we see this as one of our priorities. We need to see our community connected and engaged. We need to see people connecting. We want to know they know their neighbors. How many of you, and I want an honest answer, how many of you know your neighbors that live next door to you? Awesome. That's so great. Thank you for that. That's connection, and that's big for what it means for communities. There are people, though, that don't have that. And what we want to see is to have more people connected, engaged, so that they will be there for their neighbors. But what does connection mean? It means having a relationship within your community. And it's the strength. It truly is strength in building relationships. And engagement, when you engage with the word engagement, it's about being committed, being really committed to community. Now, I've already told you, Alberta shines. We know Alberta shines in many, many areas, and there's support of community. Again, as well, though, connection is about how are we solving problems. We know we have problems in communities. You see them every day, I see them every day. I don't have a day that goes by where my phone doesn't ring from a charity saying, I need help. I'm walking out the door today to come to present to you today, and I got a call from a charity saying, we got a young lad that his mom has just left an abusive relationship. He's living here. He has no shoes for school. It's the third day of school. He needs help. Can you help us? Or send me in the direction to need help. We all see that every day, and that's very real for community. So connection and being engaged are important because we all need to be working together and continuing to strengthen so that we're creating very healthy, vibrant, and livable communities. And livable is really important because belonging is part of that. Belonging is a human need. Each of us as individuals have that need to belong. When we look at belonging, it really means that humans are truly fundamentally and persistently motivated to have a need to belong. That is very real. I know I need to belong. I'm reminiscing over Italy and over Connaught because I went to Connaught Elementary School and lived on 15th Avenue as we just heard our first presentation. I belong in Calgary as much as I belong here because that's the roots of where I grew up. So being belonging is really important for individuals and for people being connected. And psychologists have declared that human beings human beings have to have that sense of belonging to be associated with better health and particularly mental health. And I believe that many communities are dealing with the issues we've seen consistently around suicide and extreme mental health concerns. That is a concern for communities. So are there opportunities for us to look at increasing our belonging to help to deal with some of those situations? And according to social identity theory as well, some of our senses of self is derived from the groups and the organizations we belong to. So just as we need to have food, we need to have clothes, we need to have warmth in our homes, we also need to feel included. We need to feel connected, and we also need to feel valued. So I ask you, as your community leaders, how are you striving to provide that sense of belonging as well? When you're looking at your decisions, I try in my office to do the best I can, and as a team I know we can help, definitely to help others in the belonging sense. But belonging is not purely an individual need. It's also a need for communities and for organizations. When people feel a strong sense of belonging to a group, they're more willing to contribute and take ownership. Ownership of the community, ownership of the group. So for a community, civic engagement and belonging go together. Citizens who feel like they belong will be more likely to be involved in the governments of the community. They're going to donate their time and their money for improving the communities that they live in because they care. There's also another segment to this, and that's social capital. And social capital and belonging are also very closely related. Social capital has been identified as connecting among individuals, among social networks and honesty that arise within them, being connected because they believe in people and there's honesty within. So that is another integral part of belonging. So when we look at social capital, there are a variety of forms, and we can look at them in very significant avenues, but that truly, when we look at social capital, it's about being associated with increasing sense of belonging. So social capital and belonging are very similar. And there's evidence that in communities with high social capital that children are healthier, they're safer, they're better educated, and people live longer. They're happier lives, and the economy is higher and their work satisfaction is better. So having a sense of belonging is associated with a better quality of life. And feeling a sense of belonging is really important for all because it's vice versa. The individual grows and the community grows. How many of you in the room have heard of a report called Vital Signs? Fabulous, great to see. And Bruce, it's great to have Bruce Rutley and a couple of our other committee members from Grand Prairie. But Vital Signs is a community checkup that's conducted by community foundations across our nation. And what it does is it measures the vitality of communities, and it helps to identify when we have trends, helps to look at gaps, and it also looks at the health and the well-being of communities. This report has been a touchstone for many community leaders, including civic leaders, service leaders, and funders alike. And it's also helped community foundations in our work to look at local trends and priorities. And the biggest part is it gets people talking. The Vancouver Foundation's 2010 Vital Sign report discovered that citizens, when they rated the quality of life in their communities, they placed the greatest importance on the sense of belonging. So reflecting on the results, the Vancouver Foundation took the next step. They reached out to their community. In 2012, they conducted a connections and engagement project that included a community survey. They connected with just under 4,000 people across the Metro Vancouver area to measure people's connections and engagement. They explored people's connections to their friends, their neighbors, and the community at large. They looked at their engagement in neighborhood and community life and what prevents them from being connected, engaged. Well, the Vancouver Foundation survey found that most neighborhood connections in Metro Vancouver were weak. Most residents do not participate in any form of community activity and foregoing meaningful relationships because it's a challenge for many. The Kitchener and Waterloo Community Foundation as well had the area of concern coming out of their 2012 Vital Signs report. Again, the gap was again on community belonging and leadership. Our foundation here in Grand Prairie for Northwestern Alberta, we found similar results. We are reported as one of the youngest regions in Canada. We all know our demographics here. What we have in the county of Grand Prairie, about 40% of the population are under 30, and in the city of Grand Prairie, 50% are under the age of 30. So we went out to our youth and we asked them, tell us how you feel about community. Well, what we heard from 13% of our youth between the ages of 15 and 24, not at all. That's a big number. And 23% of our citizens feel very connected to our community. So a huge gap between the two. When our foundation was founded in 1996, the name of our organization was the Community Foundation of Greater Grand Prairie. The founders thought the name encompassed the region. They felt that Grand Prairie was where we were doing work. We were supporting all of Northwestern Alberta, but that covered it. Well, we found that was not so. As I traveled out throughout the district and I connected with municipalities and funders and donors throughout the region, they said there was a wall there because the name Grand Prairie was in our name. So for many years, our board of directors, and I believe you met Baron Mans just during the lunch, he's the chair of our board of directors from Aquaterra. The board of directors analyzed this and said, you know what, this is not where we want to be. We want to open up, we want to be welcoming to all of the communities in Northwestern Alberta. So in 2012, they approved to change our name to the Community Foundation of Northwestern Alberta. And wow, what an amazing gift that was for the region. It's not about us and our business, it's about the region and how we've strengthened. As a result, we now have 3 hub community foundations under our identity from Peace River, Beaver Lodge, Sexsmith. They have their own community foundations that work directly through us, and there are satellites, and they're strengthening their communities. The barriers are gone, the walls are gone. So when I look at this, I see this as an example of community connection, engagement, and in closing, that we're working in unity with our region. So thank you.
Gian-Carlo, could you comment on your experience, mature neighborhoods, grocery stores, and you showed European models, of course, and the Basilica or the church was the center of the hub, and these commercial areas, and I think you described one area that had 2 population groups that's talking about working together because they had one central commercial zone. And what's your experience been in Calgary and in your area that you're most familiar with the impact of grocery stores coming, going, or the commercial areas?
Well, obviously grocery stores are hugely important. When you talk about Inglewood and Ramsey, it's been acknowledged that it's a little bit of a food desert. Everyone has to get in their car and drive up the hill to Forest Lawn or into the downtown to get to a grocery store. So getting a grocery store is a huge, huge mission for the community, but it's also understood that because of the economics of modern grocery stores, you need a certain number of houses in a certain trade area and then a certain number of houses in a further area. And so that was actually one of the big deciding factors that brought the growth coalition together, that sort of broke the back of the pro-growth versus anti-growth and really came down to a question of where and how. One of the reasons for deciding where and how was driven by the acknowledged need to have a grocery store as being a fundamental component of a complete community, you know, to the same extent that a school is or any number of other things. So, you know, the mission now is to sit down with the city and develop a robust plan for how many people do we need in order to have all the things that we need. And that, I think, is a really interesting conversation. One of the earlier presenters, if you don't mind me sort of branching off on a little bit of a tangent, spoke to sort of trade areas. And, you know, when we're talking about Winnipeg or Manitoba, getting the size right. And I think that there are different things, there are different sizes for different things to be right. And I think that that's what I was sort of trying to tease out, that there's a physical design, there's a regulatory size to get right, there's a governance size to get right, and there's all kinds of different flavors of community that exist at those different levels. And I think that if it's done right, you can enrich them. We're currently, as the City of Calgary, undertaking a study to figure out how many city councillors we need. Like, I represent 90,000 constituents. Jim Stevenson, who's big on the AUMA, represents a part of town that we figure he's now representing 110,000 residents. So re-ratioing that to be within line with the MGA is important. And we've established a ward boundary commission to talk about not only what the boundaries should be, but how many councillors there should be. And they set out to do their plan in terms of how many councillors and then what are the boundaries. And through this process, what we're now recognizing is that what we maybe instead of should have done is establish natural boundaries for areas of the city that can accommodate, you know, their share of the growth and their share of the tax base and everything. And that would give us the number of councillors. So actually doing it in reverse. And I think that's what you see from some of these more historic models where you have these trade areas and these historic towns in places like Italy that have reached that sort of homeostasis, and their governance builds off of that. So we're not there yet, but it's something to think about and to build towards. I hope that answered your question in some regard.
Any other questions?